Hello, I'm Michael Braden, professional archer and coach. In today's segment of Archery Tools of the Trade, I want to talk about the Loop Wedge. The Loop Wedge is a tool that I designed years ago. They say necessity is the mother of all creations, and I needed a way to measure the existing D-loop that's on my string as accurately and precisely as possible. And I also needed a way to measure the D-loop material that once cut and tied onto my string gives me that exact desired length. But before I talk about the loop wedge, we really need to have a serious conversation about the D-loop. What's it for? What's its purpose? I hope in this video that I open your eyes a little bit to the importance of the D-loop. So sit back, enjoy the video. As I begin to talk about the D-loop, I want to go back in time for a moment before D-loops. My first bow was a bear whitetail hunter that I bought at a pawn shop in 1989. And back then we weren't using D-loops. We attached our release directly to the string. And that caused several problems. One, I'm going to say wear and tear. When we attached that release to the string and we had to put all that load in one spot, it added a lot of wear and tear on that string, causing it to wear out prematurely. Also, the torque. As we applied that release directly to the string, if we come to full draw and we were to twist that release just a little bit, any of that twist was adding torque to that string, causing that string to twist. Because when we're at full draw with the let off, we didn't have a whole lot of let off back then either, but we weren't holding as much weight as we were pulling, and there wasn't as much tension on the string itself, making it easier for that release to torque the string. So then so wear and tear, torque on the string, and then also accuracy with regards to how that string launched the arrow. So back then, if you say we attached the release to the string underneath that arrow nock, well, the string material where the arrow knocked was angled downwards. So as we drew our bow back and that string angled downwards, it put downward pressure on our arrow and it put downward pressure on our arrow rest. And you could actually see somebody when they come to full draw, a slight bow, I wouldn't call it bend, but a slight bow in that arrow to show you how much downward pressure we were putting on that arrow. So you could say preload, you could say paradox, it's adding bend to that arrow. Is it consistent? Not so much. So once the D-loop really started making its way on the scene, probably in the early to mid 90s, I would call it early 90s, we started using the D-loop. And it was a much more accurate, consistent way to launch that arrow off the string. Because we're pulling, it's not perfect, but we're pulling closer to evenly above and below that arrow nock. So it's not perfect because as we put our hand in our bow and we draw our bow back, we're actually lifting up in relation to our hand. So that lifts the release aid up in that D-loop material, and it's closer to the top knot than it is the bottom knot. So it actually takes that length of string material where the arrow is snapped on the string, and that string material now, as we draw it back, angles backwards, which now gives us a little upwards lift in our arrow. So it's also critical that our arrow nock fit really well on the string. You don't want it too tight, you don't want it too loose, but the tighter that nock fits on the string might cause that arrow to lift up off your rest. Plus, any torque that's applied to that nock from the D-loop knots themselves could also apply torque on that arrow and either twist it left and right or cause it to lift up off that arrow. So nock fit is pretty important. D-loop fit, the gap in between the D-loop knots above and below that arrow nock are pretty critical too. So you'll see it a little bit better when I actually go into tying a D-loop, but I actually put a soft tie. It's basically some nylon thread material that I use to tie a peep in. I put a little soft tie above and below my arrow nock, and then the D-loop knots are on the outside of that. I feel like for me, that's the best, most accurate system to help prevent me applying unnecessary torque to the arrow knock itself. The next element of the D-loop that I want to talk about is the length. For me, the length of that D-loop is extremely critical because I look at the D-loop as part of my overall draw length equation. Not all D-loops should be created equal. It's a part of your draw length. Basically, the draw length of the bow is the distance between my grip and how the string fits my face. Then I have string on my face. Well, then I have my anchor, whether it's an index finger or whether it's a handheld. The gap between the string and the gate on my release, well, that's my D-loop. So it's a factor in the overall draw length equation. What I really need is a solid anchor. What is an anchor? An anchor is a reference that I can repeat every time, and also that is something that I can feel. If you're just kind of here on soft flesh somewhere, it's kind of hard to feel something. So to me, bone structure, I can feel bone. Whether you're shooting an index finger or, a handheld, you can put that jawbone right in between that index and that middle knuckle and feel jawbone. You can feel that reference. If it's an index finger release, whenever I draw back with an index finger, I put my index finger behind that trigger, it makes this base knuckle very pronounced. Well, there's a nice little hole underneath and behind my earlobe here at the back of my jaw that knuckle fits right into every time. So when I come to full draw, I can feel that anchor. That's reference number one. To me, reference number two is being able to touch my nose to the string. And that's very critical to me. I found it to be way more accurate than if I ever didn't touch my nose for whatever reason. I wasn't centered in my peep the same every time, and I lost some accuracy. So if I can get that nose on the string, it's pretty critical for me with regards to accuracy. So I want to be able to anchor. I want to be able to touch my nose to that string with my head in a nice, comfortable, not tense position. All right. It's going to maximize your accuracy. So my nose on the string is reference number two. Reference number three would be my peep. All right. Honestly, I look at my peep as insurance. It's insurance to tell me that my anchor and my head position is in the exact same spot it's supposed to be. If I come to full draw and for whatever reason my peep's not centered and around my housing, then I did something wrong. My anchor's not right, or my head position's not right. I should be able to come to full draw with my eyes closed. I could be in a dark blind and not be able to see my peep at all, but I know when I come to full draw, I feel my anchor, I touch my nose to the string, my peep is going to be right there. So it's very critical for me to be able to get my nose on the string. So, hence the reason why the D-loop is a part of this equation. I use the draw length of the bow and the D-loop to basically move my string on my face. All right. So if I come to full draw and I'm trying to maximize my draw length for speed and I've got my string back here on my face, well then for me to get my nose on the string, I'm having to tilt my head back and I'm having to turn my head towards the string itself. That's another aspect for me. Whenever I'm aiming, I'm looking really close. We typically are looking really close to the bridge of our nose. Whether you're using glasses or not, the bridge of your nose could be a problem. So to get the bridge out of your line of sight or out of your peep, you need to turn your head a little more straight towards that target. So if my string's back here, how am I going to get behind that string so it's not a problem? What I really need to do is move the string. If my head's here, I need to move that string farther forwards. So how do I do that? By shortening the draw length of the bow, but maybe now my draw length's not right, so now I need to come back and lengthen the D-loop to get my overall draw length right. So I look at the D-loop as part of this equation. I play with the length of the bow. I play with the D-loop to be able to get that string where it fits my face properly. So maybe you could come to full draw and take a picture, come to full draw, feel that anchor, touch your nose to the string, and get a quick snapshot of yourself and see, you know what, if I tweak the draw length of the bow and I tweak the D-loop length, that string would fit my face better. more relaxed, more comfortable, and definitely more accurate. It's something you can feel every time. So the D-loop length for me is really critical, hence the reason I designed the loop wedge. So when measuring an existing D-loop with the loop wedge, what you want to do is take the small end of the wedge, slide it in between the string and the D-loop material with the flat edge towards the string, and slide it in there and just kind of keep it straight with your index finger like I'm doing here, and pull it just as tight as it'll go until it doesn't move. So when you see that right there, what I would call that is 3/4 plus. When replacing or installing a new D-loop, these are basically the materials that I use to do that. Of course, I have my loop wedge. And to talk about the loop wedge real quick disclaimer, as you see these the raised indentions and units of measure here highlighted, your D-loop's not going to come that way. This is something that I just kind of did for myself to make it a little bit easier to see. I've yet to find a method to be able to do this in production that I really am satisfied with, so I just felt it was better just to leave well enough alone. But it is something that I do, especially for camera, to be able to see the units of measure better on camera, and for me personally to be able to see it. So you could take a ink or black Sharpie or something, and each of those units are raised, so you can kind of highlight that raised area if it's something you wanted to do to your own loop wedge. But based on the wedge itself, each of these indications, each of these units of measure is basically a 1/16 of an inch. But in playing with the angle of the wedge, I wanted enough separation in those 1/16 of an inch to be able to really accurately measure that existing D-loop once it's on my string. So if you saw in the other clip of the D-loop that's on my hunting bow, is really 3/4 of an inch plus a little bit. So it really enables you to measure that D-loop very accurately and precisely. And on this side, you're going to see basically a ruler that starts at the end of these little ears. And I'll show you that in just a second. But you're going to basically put that D-loop inside those ears and then run it along that tape measure to cut the length that you need. So in the formula, you're going to see the length of the D-loop that I'm looking for or trying to mimic, to duplicate. It's the length of that D-loop times 2 plus this formula. So right now it says 2 7/8 of an inch. That formula basically takes the 2 knots, the material that's taken up in those knots, plus when you cut it, you're still going to have to melt that last end. And that formula includes about 3/16 of an inch of that material for that melted end. So the formula is going to change based on the size of material that you use, the D-loop material, the size of that material, or how big of a melted end that you use. So personally, I use a little bit bigger, probably melted end than when I first designed this formula. So personally, I use 3 inches as my base number. So let's say you wanted a 5/8 of an inch D-loop. You're going to take that 5/8 of an inch times 2. 5/8 plus 5/8 is 1.25 inches plus that base number. So let's say I started at 3 inches. I'm going to take that 3 inches. I'm going to add 1.25 inches to it. I'm going to cut that material at 4.25 inches. Okay. So we'll talk about that again in a second. So the rest of the material that I use here is loop material. Now I use a BCY number 24 D-loop material. It's a 2mm braided material. And I personally use white. I use white because it's not dyed and the material is a little bit softer. And my focus has always been how the knots tie on the string. I feel like that softer white material, the knots are a little bit tighter, a little bit more secure than some of the colored D-loop material. But what you might find from let's say a hunting bow or being able to clip your release on the string, that some of those colored D-loop materials, because they are stiffer, it might make it a little bit easier for you to clip your release on it. but the knots to me just don't seem to tie as well. So that's personally why I use white. Now you will find with black, black is not dyed. The material actually comes black. So it is close to being as soft as the white, but any of the other colors are dyed and that material is going to be a little bit stiffer. All right. Serving thread. I use the BCY number 400 nylon serving thread. Same thread I would use if I was tying a lift cord on a cable or tying in my peep. Same material, and I like it because it is soft. So whenever I'm tying those little soft ties above and below my arrow nock, again, because they're soft, they're less likely to add torque or pressure to my arrow nock itself. Of course, lighter to melt the end of both of those. Now, this is a custom, it was originally mechanics like a snap ring pliers. So the snap ring kind of had a little protrusion that stuck out that you would stick in the eyes of a snap ring and open up and take a snap ring off of a shaft of some sort. So I've taken and sanded those off and smoothed this off, but basically we're looking for something that as I squeeze this, it opens up and it tightens up that D-loop on my string itself. Now I've actually let people borrow this whenever we were tying on a D-loop, and you can put a lot of torque on that D-loop with these. So you want to be careful. You want to make sure that those knots of the D-loop are tight and secure, but not trying to stretch it where it might cause damage to either the D-loop or your string. So be mindful of too much pressure, and of course a pair of scissors. So now, if I was going to cut a material a given length, this is a material that I just carry with me, so I always have some loose, but you could just, what's nice about being able to cut your material is cut just what you need off of this roll and not waste a whole lot. I see a lot of times guys at the shop, they'll grab some loop material and cut it. Of course, you want it longer than what you need, so they'll cut that material and then they make the loop that they need and end up cutting a couple inches off of it. So you're just wasting material. So what you'll want to do is take a fresh cut in, and I flare that in with my lighter. So I got a pretty good flare on it. And then I'm going to melt this. And I want to say melt, not burn. So I just kind of enter the flame just a little bit, put it in and take it out. And watch that the material is melting, but not burning. I feel like if you burn that material, it kind of crystallizes that melted end and it makes it more brittle. So just try to melt it, don't burn it. So I'm going to flatten that in there a little bit, and then I'm going to do it one more time. It'd help if I didn't talk into the flame of my lighter. So I'm just going to warm it up just one more time, just to kind of soften up those edges that I flared. So now, on my measurement side of my D-loop, there are two little ears on this end. And this end is where that unit of measure, that ruler basically starts from, this end. So I'm going to put the D-loop inside those ears and pull that melted end to where it comes in flat with those ears. And then I'm going to pull my cord along that ruler. So I'm going to replace the D-loop that's on my hunting bow, and it's 3/4 of an inch plus, right? So I'm going to take the 3/4 times 2, that's 1.5 inches. I'm going to start with 3 inches, but it wanted it the plus. So it's in the vicinity of about a 32nd of an inch longer than 3/4 of an inch. So keep in mind, if you're going to play with the length of your D-loop, maybe let's say I wanted this D-loop a 1/16 of an inch longer. So I'm not going to just cut my material a 1/16 of an inch longer. I'm going to cut it 1/8 of an inch. So again, it's the length of that loop times 2, because you need a 1/16 of an inch on both sides of the loop to give you that 1/16 of an inch longer D-loop. So, but I like the length of where that is, so I'm going to stick with the 3/4 plus. So I'm going to take my 3 inches plus 1.5 inches plus about a 1/16 of an inch. So I'm going to cut this 4 9/16 of an inch. I'm going to clip it right there a couple times. Now, whether you can just clip it with a pair of scissors or you can lay a knife on there. I know a good buddy of mine, Darren Christenberry, he always talks about there's a knife edge in here. It's because he's using a knife. So he knows exactly where to cut his material because he's cutting it the same length every time. So once you get it cut, it's not all the way cut in two, but now I can see where that is. I'm going to cut that off. Now I'm going to take the other end of this, just like the first end. I'm going to flare this in pretty good. And again, this is going to take up about 3/16 of an inch to 1/4 of that material. But it's already factored into that initial 3 inches. So again, I'm melting it, not burning it. So just put it in the flame, take it out a few times, get you a decent melted end right there. And I want to flare it just a little bit to make sure that that melted ball is not going to pull through that 1/2 inch knot that we put on, that we tie it with. So I'm going to flatten it just a little bit. That looks pretty good to me. So that's how I'm going to cut my material. Now, another note for you is really about 5/8 of an inch of D-loop is about as short as you could cut this material and actually tie it on your string. When you get much shorter than that, you just really can't tie that last knot on. So if you needed a D-loop shorter than 5/8 of an inch, then you probably are going to have to do it on the bow itself. It's the only way you're going to be able to do that. So, and again, honestly, I hate to see a D-loop really shorter than 5/8 of an inch, because then you can still kind of get back into where that loop is so short that you're not gaining the forgiveness of what that D-loop will give you with regards to any twist in your hand or release once you're at full draw. So I'd love to see you stay in the vicinity of 5/8 of an inch or longer to give you that forgiveness if possible. But if it is something that you just need because of axle to axle of the bow or how that string fits your face, and that's what you need, then go for it. I would rather it fit you and fit your face rather than worry about that little bit of twist or a little bit of torque there on the D-loop. So now let's get this installed. Now that I've cut my length of material to give me the D-loop that I need, which was the 3/4 plus, one thing that I would do, let's assume the bow was tuned and shooting good, and all I want to do is just replace my loop here. So what I would do, but I'm going to assume the loop is going to be replaced, and I'm going to go ahead and cut my ties loose because I want to show you that. So one thing that I would add to my collection of tools to use would be a set of calipers. So what I want to do is I need to measure something. So I'm not going to untie my peep, and my peep was in a really good place. So what I'm going to do is measure from my peep, and I always measure to the bottom of the top tie. That is always going to be my go-to measurement that I'm going to reference all the time, is the bottom of my top tie. And mostly because, as I described earlier, that as we draw our bow back, we are pulling up on the string against our hand. So we're more apt to pull up the bottom D-loop knot, and that's going to pull into the bottom tie. So the thing that's going to move the last is going to be this top tie and this top knot. So that's why I always want to reference that. And then as I come back, I can add the lowers back where I want them. But first thing I'm going to do is write down on a piece of paper the peep to bottom of the top tie measurement. So where can I measure this peep? Do I want to measure this peep in the center? Well, that's kind of hard to get perfect every time. So what I do is hang my caliper inside this top part of this housing. It's not going to move. It's not going to change. And then I adjust my caliper until it's even with the very bottom of my top tie. And right there, I'm going to say I'm 5 inches, 0.232. All right. So I'm going to write that down as 5.232. All right. 5 inches, 232 thousandths of an inch. All right. So one, I could either write it down or I could lock down my calipers here in that spot so it's not going to move. All right, so now I'm going to remove this. I could grab a blade to pull my D-loop off, but personally what I always do is fold this D-loop kind of over the knot, and I'm going to hold this inside part of this knot, which equals the inside loop. And maybe also as a note before I forget, whenever you tie your knot, I want you to kind of see how this is tied. So one, if you look at the loop materials, you'll see that loop material is on the inside of the knot on both sides versus this being on the outside of those knots. So I want to pull as close to the arrow nock as I can without pinching it or adding some torque to that nock. So that's how I would do that. And also, being a right-handed archer, I also tie my knots a certain way. So one, they're on opposite sides of that string so that they're pulling evenly from both sides. But I also tie it with this melted in on top on this side, because what happens with currently I shoot an index finger release and my hand is pretty flat and my gate of my release is pretty flat. But if I were going to shoot a handheld release as a right-handed archer, basically what happens is people turn their hand like this on their face, okay? So what we're doing is twisting this D-loop this way. And so for me, I don't know that you can really see this, but as I twist this loop this way, see if it'll kind of hold that bend just a little bit. As I twist this way, the loop material comes out of that knot in a more natural direction that if I turned them the other way, it would basically twist this way, and this material would want to twist over the knot in an unnatural manner. So that's how I tie and why I tie my loop a certain way. So now I'm going to go back to taking this off. I'm going to take my thumbnail and hold this piece of this knot right here really tight with my thumb, and then I'm going to peel this portion of the knot away, and that's going to loosen that knot enough so that I can untie it. Okay, untie that side. This side again, I'm going to pull it down, and then I'm going to hold, I don't know that I can show you this, I'm going to hold this with my thumb and peel this part of this half hitch away from my thumb, and that's going to open up that D-loop, okay? So I can take that off without cutting it. But now the ties, obviously I'm going to have to cut this. So one, I don't want to cut my serving. So I'm going to lay the blade really close to my serving material and just cut the soft tie. So I'm keeping that blade this pretty much parallel to my serving thread so that I don't cut that serving thread. Okay, so now I've got nothing here. What I may also do is grab a silver Sharpie, and what I'm going to do is grab my calipers again. And again, the caliper represents the distance between the top of my peep and the bottom of the top tie. So basically looking at that, once I get that mark, I can see where that is. I'm going to be inside that mark, basically one rib right there is my measurement. So now I'm going to take some of my serving thread. This is BCY number 400 nylon serving thread. And I always want to start on the nock side of my tie. So I'm going to tie my top knot first, bringing my material back even here. So I'm going to put this right where I wanted that one rib in from the bottom of that silver Sharpie mark. So I basically just tied, the first part of a square knot. I did not tie a square knot yet. And I'm going to go, and I did that on top, and now this one is going to go on the bottom side of the string. And I'm going to tie one more half of a square knot. And I tell you what, right here, I'm going to go ahead and tie a square knot. So I don't want to take this right now. I snugged that first part of the tie up pretty good. This one now I want to leave that material loose so that I don't pull that first part of that square knot loose. So I'm just going to lay this in and snug that square knot up. And now I'm going to go underneath and tie a second square knot. So just in case this first square knot comes loose, I have another one that's going to stay secure. All right, I'm going to snug that up and then let that loose. Tie the second half of my square knot. Again, keeping it loose now. And then I'm going to bring this in and snug that up. All right, so now that is my top tie. I'm going to cut this off. I prefer to do it with a pair of scissors so that if I'm cutting it with a knife, I'm not going to pull that knot loose. So then I'll take that and go ahead and melt these ends. You want to make sure not to get your serving or your string too hot. So now what you'll find is your serving material here is basically like thread on a bolt. And your tie here now is basically like a nut. So once I tied this, if I were going to go and shoot through paper, maybe I didn't want to move my rest to adjust my tune, I could still come back and move my knot. So I might pull my D-loop loose, and then I can take this tie and I can just spin this tie. And see how I'm going down? See how I lost my mark right there? And I'm going to twist it this way. So you can just turn that up or down until you get back to your measurement that you want. All right. So now I'm right back on my mark with my caliper. So now what you want to do is decide what nock I'm going to use. And I'll go ahead and place my arrow in my nock up against that top tie. So now I'm going to tie my bottom. And ideally, I'll show you in a second, but I want a little bit of gap, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I've got my nock pretty snug up against that top tie. And this one, I'm going to just get close. But chances are it's not going to be super tight, which is what I want, and I'll show you that in just a second. I'm just going to pull this up and secure that one. But again, I'm going to start on the nock side of my tie, and I'm going to go away from my nock. I put up half of a square knot on top, half of a square knot on bottom. Now, honestly, now I'm going to remove the arrow just to get it out of my way. I'm going back on top. And so when I did my top tie, I basically square knotted right there. But I'm going to go ahead and put 2 more ties on the bottom, because I would like to make the bottom a little bit longer than the top. One, for security reasons. I told you a second ago that as we draw our bow back, we're lifting upwards on the string. We're pulling our D-loop upwards. And also I talked a little bit about before, whenever we draw back with our D-loop material with our release, the release ends up moving upwards closer to the top tie, which causes this material to move. So adding a little bit extra material on the bottom helps prevent or keeps the release a little closer to the center of your arrow nock. So now I'm going to go ahead and tie. Now I added basically two ties from the top to make the bottom just 2 ties longer than the top. So now I'm going to square knot. Top, square knot on the bottom. I'm going to cinch that up snug and then let it loose so that I don't pull that first tie loose. I'm going to bring this in nice and tight, keeping all those threads as stacked together the best I can. Take my scissors and clip that. Now, if you'll see, I'm also turning this thread so that the flame is on the outside of the string. I want to keep that flame away from the string as much as possible, because your string material does not like a direct flame. It will not end well. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want just a little bit of play. Kind of see that little bit of movement. Do we call that about a 32nd of an inch? Yeah, it's not a 16th. Let's call it a 32nd of an inch. And that's where I would start with a new tie. Now, the top tie is measured basically where I wanted it. And I moved the bottom one down a little bit because, again, as we're drawing our bow back, we're lifting up on that D loop. We're pulling it upwards on the string. I am going to end up, after you shoot 20 to 50 shots, maybe, you're going to end up pulling that knot up just a little bit, and it's going to close that gap. So ideally, I don't want any gap in there at the end of the day, because what if I knocked it against my bottom tie and shot it, or I knocked against my top tie and shot it? It would probably change my elevation of point of impact just a little bit. So I want them to touch at the end of the day, but not be too tight. So that right there is a really good amount of space to tie that. So now I'm going to take my original material. So now at the end of what you're going to see is this middle portion is going to be my loop. So I'm going to take this and I'm wrapping it around the string, but I'm going on this is basically a half hitch. So I'm going on the inside of my loop material. I'm going around that loop material and back around the string, and then inside that loop on the same side as my loop material. So the melted end should come out of there on the same side. So then I'm going to start pulling that. I'm trying to get my hand out of the way of you guys to be able to see that. So whenever I'm first pulling this first one tight, I want to make sure that this portion of the knot is kind of staying nice and tight, so that it helps secure that melted end that we melted on the D-loop. So I want to go ahead and pull this one pretty snug, and then kind of just go ahead and initial set the direction in relation to my peep. I'm going to make this loop. So now I went on this side of the string first. Now I'm going to go on this side of the string inside my loop, and I'm going to go ahead and pull that relatively snug. I'm going around my loop material and then back around the string where it came from, and then up into this hole, so that you should see the melted end and my loop material are coming out of the same side of this knot. All right. So now I can snug that up a little bit. But again, I want to make sure that I'm keeping this portion nice and tight, nice and secure. This portion nice and tight, nice and secure. So then I'm going to grab my loop pliers. And again, these were originally snap ring pliers. So now this one's a little bit tighter than this one. So what I'm going to do is angle this towards this knot just a little bit. But basically, I'm just going to slowly snug this thing up a little bit to make sure these are nice and tight. But I didn't put a whole lot of pressure on this loop. Enough to really secure knots, but I'm not trying to break it either. So this is not one of those, make it as tight as you can get, you're not going to break it. You can break that. You can break the loop. And if you're breaking the loop, you're probably putting too much wear and tear on the string itself. So that feels pretty good. At the end of the day, where I ended up being, I am, call that 3/4 plus. I can't really see it myself on this side. Let me look at it. I'm really happy with that. I can show you, but man, that is just right spot on, 3/4 plus, which is what I was looking for. So one, the loop wedge gives me that opportunity to measure my existing loop as precisely as possible. It gives me a unit of measure on this side to be able to cut my material. So once it's installed, it gives me that exact same length. So there's no reason why you shouldn't have a couple of these cut and melted pieces of material in your backpack, in your hunting stuff, or definitely within your target quiver, so that if something were to happen, you were to fray a D-loop and you're thinking about, man, I don't know if it's going to make it the rest of the day, I can change that D-loop pretty quickly and get back on the range and get back to hunting. In closing, I hope you have a better understanding of the importance of the D-loop. The D-loop is not just a place to attach my release to the string. It serves many purposes. It's one of the best, most accurate ways, I believe, to launch an arrow off the string. It's an important part of my overall draw length equation. It's also an important part to be able to adjust the string so it fits my face better, to improve my accuracy. If you like this video, please leave a comment below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. It helps me provide content for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it.